Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about our project here. I know we've had a busy morning for you and afternoon for me here in the UK in regard to our various presentations and so forth. So I'm conscious of time and the wish for people to ask questions of all the presenters. So I will proceed here. This is a recently completed project, but in some ways these things are always ongoing. But I will speak to this particular study right now. Let me just see if it will do this. Just to yeah. So I'm presuming everyone can see the screen all right. And okay, so the context of the study, just to leap into it quite into the deep end, really, without all sorts of prior discussion that we could probably usefully have. But it's basically, it's right in the discussion in regard to the emergence of new institutions in the governance of transnational labor relations in both global companies and increasingly in their supply chains. We've had earlier efforts in international union federations and so forth with international union associations before they became federations in regard to suppliers, but that complexity has been it's increasingly addressed now. So among these new institutions is the emergence of global union federations, historically recent, last 20 years or so, moving on from the much longer traditions of international efforts. These are comprised of affiliated democratic unions around the world, and some of the prominent ones I've just listed there: Industrial, Global Union, Industrial, Uni-Global, and so forth. Some of the other colleagues this afternoon have already spoken about some of the global unions. Okay, so this is the context. What are these actors doing and how are they interacting? So what is significant in regard to this project is that global union federations pursue transnational social dialogue, and that includes the development of global framework agreements. That should be global, not global there. And this other point to emphasize here is that these are targeted toward, these are strategically focused on the corporate level of the multinational. So the HQ actors and a GUF, and quite often a IG Metall or another prominent union is also a signatory. But the two main signatories are the GUF and the company headquarter actors. And as I said, IG Metall. So they aim to pursue this transnational social dialogue, and in the course of that, to be formal, to exert a regulatory effect, so a governance effect on the MNC's labor actions throughout its entities and suppliers. And that's the kind of extra layer of effort and significance that the GFA proposes to contribute. Just again, I'm being a little bit brief here. There is an historical background to global framework agreements, of international framework agreements. They're part of a category of transnational company agreements with a longer history. About 15 years or so ago, there was a flurry of interest in these things, the IFAs and the early global ones, but they were disappointing to European eyes and meant people backed off from pursuing them. And so there was something of a quietening of that effort. Nonetheless, the GUFs have continued to pursue the GFA, and they have developed what we are now calling a second generation, probably identifiable over the last decade at most, in the recent years, or including the renewal of older agreements. So these newer agreements, whether they are completely new or recent, as well as the renegotiated or re-agreed existing older agreement. These have stronger content and formally include joint monitoring and compliance structures. They also include the commitment of on part of the company to establish with the various unions, the global unions, obviously, but also other well, usually IG Metall, but some other players might might enter into this, but a global company forum, a global works councils, as we've called them in the past. Companies may be just using the term forum, works council. It's the institution that matters rather than the title of it. So the new GFAs are both aiming to be fully global. Now that's just not necessarily a planetary global. I think it's important to make that distinction, because we're observing in industrial relations discussions that sometimes people use the word global to refer to the planet, as I'm inclined to do, but the GFAs actually refer to global for the multinational company. You know, these sort of global actors, as some of the other people studying multinational speak of, refers to the company. But in many ways, this combines things. This is both planetarily global, but it is in the first instance global in regard to the global multinational company. So we know, I mean, this is a brief setting. I'm going a little fast here because I'm conscious of time, but we know that despite discussions about globalization is over, there's mixed evidence about that, and global expansion is continuing. We see an increase in emerging market economies aiming to participate in global production and supply operations. And in the case of our study, it's the giant German headquartered companies that we're interested in studying. All sorts of institutional reasons for that. Again, I will presume you're rather familiar with that, but if not, I'm more than happy to speak about that, the context of the German HQ companies and their activities in Asia Pacific. Some of their companies has been there for 100 years, a long time, but the dramatic expansion we collectively have witnessed in recent decades. So they are the majority of companies that have adopted the GFA, and they also have very strong support of their headquarter unions and European works councils. So we conducted a study, a sociological study, an interpretive sociological study. So we listening to some other speakers today about getting on the ground. That was indeed our effort, even though the pandemic did prevent us from travel to South Asia, to India and other South Asian countries. We managed to conduct interviews on remotely, and to participate also as observers only at a global works council for one of the global companies under study. Okay, so I'm just moving through the methodological approach without detail here, but our effort was to inquire into what's going on, a broad sociological question, and focusing it on what's going on for on-the-ground actors. What are they doing? What do they consider effective? One of the reasons that the earlier international framework agreements were regarded as disappointing in a Eurocentric point of view was that their effectiveness was problematic. They for various reasons, and some of the earlier efforts did try to get at that, but there wasn't perhaps enough seeking of what local actors considered to be effective. The framework being precisely that, it entails experimentation, flexibility, capacity for actor negotiation of what the framework can mean. Of course, it does also have certain baselines of, at minimum, ensuring the ILO global labor standards are applied throughout. So there are the basic agreements that are elements of the agreement are already in. So just very briefly, I'm going to give a couple of little illustrations in a minute, but I'm going straight to the point of some favorable headlines. I'm expecting, in a way, people to, maybe not people in this room, but in other audiences, to sort of like, oh, it can't be favorable, nothing's going to work. And anyway, our evidence proposes to demonstrate that the GFA accomplishes a commitment to ongoing cooperative relationships. Now that in itself is nothing to sneeze at. It enables the institutionalization of conflict recognition. In the first instance, that is conflict recognition and its expression. Yeah, and they also, we have evidence that they are able to, well, they are stimulating global demand for effective transnational dialogue. These are ideational benefits. The people who are receiving these things are thinking about them and finding ways to take local actor initiatives to make them work for themselves. So we're seeing that there is certainly a development of multi-level, multi-actor and network dialogue developments, and that these are able to encourage and even accomplish joint participation in decisions and therefore exert a regulatory effect. So this, in some, you can see what I've written there, that the transnational labor actors use the GFA as a global resource. It is a resource. It's an agreement with a framework that enables people to take local and transnational interventions. And we have evidence for people doing precisely that. Once again, I'm feeling that just to anticipate, maybe again, not in this room, but in other forums, I expect, and I receive these concerns that that favorable headlines are unlikely to be taken at face value, of course. So, and I'm fully aware of that. So the reality check is that global framework agreements, for all the effort of some favorable words about them, are an institution in the making. Okay, so these, to make gains, to forge pathways and build edifices on those pathways and demands, to sustain the demand, really present immense challenges. There's no question that the vast majority of multinational companies in the world are not only not interested in these interventions, they're actively avoidant of them. Some of the companies that have these agreements, there's a rather prominent case, a company in which its United States subsidiaries have refused to recognize the agreement, so Industrial has suspended the agreement. This is another debate, right? So people may continue to be disappointed, and there's plenty of reasons to be disappointed. Nonetheless, a Gulf actor, it is an Industrial, I can declare that here, but in some other forums, it's one is careful about just how much one identifies. Nonetheless, this is an indicator of how it begins to get received by people on the ground. Yeah, so not the Geneva actors, but people out there. So it's perceived as radical. It's the very idea that companies have signed up to an agreement that requires it to have a monitoring committees, to have compliance measures that can be scrutinized, and for non-compliance to have an interventionary response. So it is an extremely important instrument for actors in Asia Pacific and elsewhere, but for here. So, and here's an example, not from a Gulf actor now, but from a local actor who was a union leader and an active worker on the plant. And they learned about the GFA, the background for how they've learned it, about sort of initial efforts to transfer that as somewhat of an extra story that I could tell, but I'm just getting to the story. So the agreement has enabled them to become aware of the possibility that that they have now a right to demand meetings. Many of these companies, these are subsidiary sites of prominent German multinationals, in which the home country workers would not tolerate any of this for 1 second. But abroad, in these companies, which bear the same colors and their plants bear the name of invisible, very visible print, huge signs of the home country's headquarters, brand name. All of these companies own their own brands. There's some things I've missed out on telling you about the methods and the designations of the companies. They all own their own brands. They are producer lead producers in their supply chains. So the fact that these local unions are now talking with HR managers for local actors, this is very big. This is their words to us. We are talking, they are talking to us. Whoops, another one there. They've learned things that, what does freedom of association, we're all very familiar with that terminology. It's enshrined in the ILO and various other forums. To regular people, freedom of association doesn't mean, what does that mean? The questions are, what does that mean? And how are we supposed to do it? It doesn't immediately communicate what we're already familiar with. So it means that everyone should have a right to join a union, and that the companies, this is the subsidiaries companies, have got to stop union busting. Once again, I underscore, stopping union busting is no small accomplishment. Yet another complex part of the world, this is the entire Asia Pacific is so hugely complex that we've offered no comparative study whatsoever. It's beyond the scope of the project. But in China, where we know about their unions are not considered free by the standards of the ILO and by the standards of the global unions. Nonetheless, the companies which have these global framework agreements have activities often through other avenues toward engaging with personnel in China. So things that have been accomplished are sorts of forms of participation, forms of communication, forms of international exchange, visits, the extensive networking that has occurred through the signatories of the agreement and local union actors. This particular respondent reported, this is very surprising, remarkable. It's new, and this was a seasoned, the fellow whom I spoke with here was a well-experienced actor and was noting this as a significant intervention for them. So networking is part of the, how am I going for time here? I'm conscious I can't see my clock because I'm seeing the screen.
You're basically out of time. So
I'm basically out of time. Let me just get to the sorry, I know it's just done this for all of us. Can I just get to the conclusion? Would that be all right? Am I out of time? Would you rather I stopped here? Yes, I think you probably would. All right, I'm going to just conclude that the ambition of the GFA and the empirical realities on the ground certainly reveal a wide distance. Immense obstacles remain, but nonetheless, we have evidence that we would like to persuade of that these things are worth investing in. Okay, thank you very much.